Elizabeth Carter set her husband's untouched breakfast plate back on the table, picked up her shawl, and walked out the front door without looking back. Not because she had stopped loving him, but because she had finally stopped lying to herself about what love was supposed to feel like. For 2 years, she had given Nathaniel Brooks everything a woman could offer: her patience, her devotion, her silence, and he had taken all of it without once asking her name. If you've ever loved someone who never truly saw you stay until the very end, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the harvest gathering. Elizabeth Carter was awake before the sun touched the ridge. She had been awake most of the night if she was honest with herself, though she would not have admitted that to anyone. Not to the kitchen girl who brought fresh water at dawn. Not to the older housewoman, Mrs. Hale, who had worked in Brooks Valley longer than Elizabeth had been alive. Certainly not to her husband, Nathaniel Brooks, who slept in the room at the far end of the hall and had not knocked on her door in 4 months. Elizabeth stood at the small mirror above her wash basin and looked at herself the way a woman looks at something she is trying to remember before it disappears. She was 24 years old. She had brown hair that caught the light a certain way in summer, and eyes that her mother had once described as the color of still creek water. She was not the kind of woman who stopped a room. She had always known that, but she had believed, truly believed, in the particular hopeful way that young women believe things before life teaches them otherwise, that she was the kind of woman who could stop one man. One specific man. She had been wrong. She finished dressing without calling for help. She pinned the blue fabric at her collar and smoothed the front of the skirt with both palms, the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl, standing in their farmhouse kitchen in the Virginia foothills. Her mother used to say that a woman who could present herself well on difficult mornings had more courage than most people ever noticed. Elizabeth was trying very hard to have courage. The gathering was set for that evening at Brooks Valley, which was what everyone in the county called the estate, as if the land itself belonged more to the name than to any particular man. It was a large property, well-managed, running profitable crops of tobacco and wheat, with a timber operation along the northern edge and 3 tenant farms at the southern boundary. Nathaniel had inherited it from his father at the age of 26, and had run it with the kind of cold efficiency that made other landowners admire him and made the people who worked for him keep a careful distance. Elizabeth had married him 2 summers ago at a wedding that the county talked about for weeks afterward, not because it had been romantic, but because it had been impressive. The Brooks family had standing. The Carter family had a good name and a modest piece of farmland and a daughter who everyone agreed was a sensible and capable young woman. The match had made sense on paper. It had never quite made sense anywhere else. She went downstairs and into the kitchen, where she knew exactly what she was going to find. Nathaniel's breakfast plate, untouched, the coffee cooling in the cup, and no sign of her husband, except for the sound of his boots on the study floor overhead. He had been up since before her. He was always up before her. Mrs. Brooks. The kitchen girl, young Della, looked up from the fire with the careful expression of someone who had learned to read the temperature of a room. "Shall I keep his plate warm?" "No," Elizabeth said. "He won't come down before he rides out. You know that." Della pressed her lips together and said nothing, because she did know that, and because there was nothing useful to say about it. Elizabeth poured herself coffee, sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, which felt too large and too formal for one person eating alone, and looked out the window at the summer morning turning gold over the east field. She thought about the gathering tonight. She had been thinking about it for weeks, if she was honest. She had thought about the blue dress. She had thought about the way the great room at Brooks Valley looked when it was lit up for company. The candles, the polished floors, the smell of good tobacco, and the sound of a fiddle from the far corner. She had thought about standing beside Nathaniel at these events, the way she had done twice before, smiling at people she barely knew, answering questions about the farm, accepting compliments about the household that she had worked genuinely hard to deserve. She had thought in the way she still allowed herself to think sometimes, even though she knew better that tonight might be different, that he might look at her. That was the whole of it, reduced to its plainest form. She wanted her husband to look at her the way a man looks at a woman he chose to marry. She had not asked for declarations. She had not demanded courtship or poetry or any of the soft extravagances she had read about in the novels her father kept on the shelf above the fireplace. She had asked for one thing in every quiet and indirect way a woman of her time and station could ask for it. She had asked to be seen. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup herself, and went to find Mrs. Hale to discuss the arrangements for the evening. Nathaniel Brooks came downstairs at 8:30, already dressed for riding his hat in his hand, and his mind clearly somewhere ahead of him on the road. He passed the kitchen doorway without stopping. Elizabeth was standing at the hall table, sorting through the linen list Mrs. Hale had given her, and she looked up when she heard him. "Good morning," she said. He paused. Not stopped, paused, in the way a man pauses when he remembers there is a social obligation he has nearly walked past. "Morning," he said. He looked at the list in her hands, rather than at her face. "The gathering is tonight," she said. "I thought we might go together. Arrive together, I mean. It might make a better impression with the Hartfield family if we—" "I'll be riding in separately. I have business with Caldwell in the afternoon that may run long, of course." She kept her voice steady. She had a great deal of practice keeping her voice steady. "I'll have the carriage brought around at 6 then." He was already moving toward the door. "Nathaniel." He stopped, turned, and for one moment she saw something cross his face that she couldn't quite read. Not warmth exactly. Not coldness either. Something more like a man who has suddenly become aware that he is in a room he does not know how to navigate. "The blue dress," she said, because she had decided she would say it even if it was foolish, even if it changed nothing. "I made it for tonight. I thought you'd want to know." A beat of silence. "I'm sure it'll be fine," he said, and walked out. She stood in the hall and listened to the sound of his boots across the porch, then the creak of the gate, then nothing. She folded the linen list carefully and set it on the table. Fine. The gathering filled Brooks Valley, the way water fills a low field gradually, then all at once. By 7 in the evening, the great room held at least 60 people. Landowners and their wives merchants up from Richmond, a lawyer from Fredericksburg, 2 families from the western counties who had come in by road the day before and were staying through Sunday. The summer heat had softened into something almost bearable, and someone had propped the long windows open so the smell of the garden drifted in between the music. Elizabeth arrived on time in the blue dress alone. She greeted Mrs. Hartfield near the entry and accepted a glass of cold water from a passing servant and smiled at the right moments and asked the right questions, and she did all of it. The way a person does a thing they have done so many times, it has become a kind of armor. She was looking for Nathaniel. She told herself she was not looking for Nathaniel, but she was. She found him 20 minutes later, standing near the far window with a cluster of men she recognized: Caldwell, the land agent, and 2 brothers from the county north of them who ran a significant timber operation. They were deep in conversation, the kind of conversation that has a particular posture to it. Shoulders squared, voices low. No one looking anywhere but at each other. Nathaniel looked well. He always looked well in company. He had the kind of presence that filled a room quietly, without demanding it, tall and lean and serious-faced, the sort of man who other men trusted with things that mattered. She had noticed that about him even before she had married him. She had thought it meant he was the kind of man who took the important things seriously. She had not understood then that she would not be one of the important things. She made her way toward him, crossing the room with the careful social navigation of a woman who knows every person in the space and is known by all of them and is somehow still alone. "Nathaniel," she said, arriving at the edge of the group. The men turned. There were nods and small greetings. Caldwell tipped his head and said, "Mrs. Brooks, good evening." The Halbert brothers both offered the kind of formal courtesy that Virginia men of that generation performed as automatically as breathing. Nathaniel turned last. His eyes moved over her quickly, the blue dress, her face, the glass in her hand, and he said, "Elizabeth," in the tone of a man completing a small administrative task. Then his gaze moved back to Caldwell. "As I was saying," he continued, "the northern acreage should be cleared before the first frost if we're to prep the soil by spring." Elizabeth stood there for one more moment. Then she turned very quietly and walked away. She walked back across the room and out through the side door into the garden, and she stood in the summer dark with her hands around her glass, and she breathed in and she breathed out, and she told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that it was fine. It was fine. It was not fine. She heard laughter from inside. Not just any laughter. Specific laughter. The kind that is designed, whether consciously or not, to travel bright and confident and carrying the message. I am delightful, and I know it across whatever distance separates it from the people it wants to reach. Elizabeth turned and looked back through the open window. A woman had appeared near the group of men by the far wall. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, wearing a yellow dress that had cost more than Elizabeth's father made from the farm in a good season. She was laughing at something Caldwell had said, though she was looking at Nathaniel when she laughed. Her name was Margaret Whitmore. Elizabeth knew who she was. The daughter of a Richmond merchant recently widowed, come to the county to visit relations for the summer. She was the kind of woman who knew exactly how to enter a room and exactly what to do once she was in it. Elizabeth watched Nathaniel's face change. It was a small change. Anyone who hadn't spent 2 years studying that face might have missed it entirely. A slight easing around the jaw. Something in the eyes that softened just at the edges. The faintest shift of his weight toward the sound of that laughter rather than away from it. He smiled. Not a social smile. Not the performance of a smile that Elizabeth had catalogued and recognized and learned not to take personally. A real one, brief and unguarded, and belonging to a man who for one undefended moment was pleased. Elizabeth looked at that smile for as long as she could stand to look at it. Then she turned away and stared out at the dark garden and felt something inside her go very still, not break. She had expected at some point to feel something break. What she felt instead was quieter and, in its way, more final. It was the feeling of a door closing, not being slammed, not being locked, just easing shut on the other side of something she had been trying to walk through for 2 years. She set her glass down on the stone ledge beside her. She thought, I have been patient. I have been kind. I have been every single thing I knew how to be, she thought. And none of it was enough, because the problem was never that I wasn't enough. The problem was that he never looked. She stood in the garden until the sound of music started up inside, and then she went back in and spent the rest of the evening being exactly the kind of guest she had always been, pleasant and composed and useful and almost entirely invisible. And she did it with the particular grace of a woman who has just made a very quiet and very serious decision. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed in the room at the front of the house and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of timber, the distant sound of Nathaniel's door, the soft, persistent sound of the summer crickets outside the window, and she thought clearly for the first time in a long time about the shape of her life. She thought about what she had given. 2 years of breakfasts made and left untouched. 2 years of conversations initiated and not continued. 2 years of evenings spent in the same house as a man who treated her presence the way he treated the furniture, acknowledged when necessary, otherwise unremarked upon. 2 years of waiting in the particular breathless way that women wait when they believe that patience is a virtue and love is a thing you can earn if you are only good enough. She thought about Margaret Whitmore's yellow dress. She thought about the smile on Nathaniel's face that she had never once put there. And she thought, and this was the thought that changed everything, the one she had been circling for months without letting herself land on it. She thought, what if waiting isn't patience? What if waiting is just another word for disappearing? She turned onto her side and looked at the window. The first light of dawn was coming in thin and pale over the ridge. She had been disappearing. Quietly, incrementally, in the way that women of her time and place were encouraged to disappear into domestic usefulness, into social obligation, into the daily performance of a role that everyone around her recognized as admirable and no one recognized as lonely. She had been vanishing one morning at a time, and she had called it devotion. She sat up in bed. She pressed both hands flat against the quilt her mother had made, pieced from fabric scraps over a long winter, given to Elizabeth on her wedding morning, with a look that said, I hope you will be happy, and an embrace that said, I am afraid you will not be. and she made herself hold one thought steady until it settled into something she could keep. She was 24 years old. She was not old. She was not finished. She was not, despite every morning she had spent in that quiet house waiting for footsteps that did not come without value. She was simply in the wrong story. The one where she waited to be noticed rather than the one where she decided she didn't need to wait. She got out of bed before the house was awake. She went down to the kitchen, and she stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she watched the summer morning come up over the east field, and she thought about what she was going to do differently. She started with the accounts. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because it was the thing she could do immediately, the thing that required no one's permission and owed no one an explanation. Her father had taught her figures from the time she was old enough to sit at a table and hold a pen, and she had always kept the household accounts at Brooks Valley with a thoroughness that Nathaniel acknowledged in the same way he acknowledged everything she did by not complaining. But the farm accounts were a different matter. Those belonged to Caldwell, the land agent who had been managing Nathaniel's business affairs for 7 years, and who Elizabeth had quietly noticed over the course of 24 months, a persistent and creative relationship with the numbers he reported. She had noticed it the way she noticed everything in that house carefully from the margins without making a sound about it. She pulled the household ledgers and set them beside the quarterly reports. Caldwell left on the study desk, and she started comparing. By mid-morning, she had found 4 discrepancies she could document cleanly. By early afternoon, she had found 7 more. She sat back in the chair, Nathaniel's study chair, which she had never sat in before, which was larger than she had expected, and faced the window differently than she had imagined, and she looked at what she had assembled, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt useful. Not useful in the way of a woman who has arranged a room or managed a guest list. Useful in the way of a person who has done something that actually matters. She had uncovered a fraud that was bleeding her husband's estate by what she estimated conservatively was somewhere between 12 and 15% of the annual yield. She was not thinking about Nathaniel's gratitude. She was not performing the action in order to earn something. She was doing it because it needed doing, because she was capable of doing it, and because this was the part she held carefully. Like something still fragile, she had decided she was going to stop making herself smaller than her actual size. She copied her findings into a clean document in her own hand, folded it, and left it on the desk where Nathaniel would find it. Then she went to find Mrs. Hale to ask about the children in the tenant village at the south boundary specifically. She wanted to know which of them were of an age to learn reading, and whether any of their parents might be amenable to her coming twice a week. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Hale stopped in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who has been surprised by something she is not sure she has permission to approve of. "You're asking about the tenant children?" "I am. The ones old enough to learn letters and figures. Do you know how many there are? 8 or 9, I'd reckon." Mrs. Hale set down the basket she was carrying. "Maybe 10 counting the Darcy girl who's younger but bright as anything. But Mrs. Brooks, their parents, work from first light. And you'd be going to the south boundary yourself." "I would." "On your own. I'd take one of the stable boys for company if it makes you easier, but yes." Mrs. Hale was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman given to easy speech, but Elizabeth had learned to read the particular quality of her silences, and this one had something approving in it cautiously. "Young Thomas could go with you," Mrs. Hale said finally. "He knows those families, and he's reliable." "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "I'd like to start Thursday." She walked out of the kitchen and heard just behind her the very quiet sound of Mrs. Hale allowing herself a small exhale that in another woman might have been called a sigh of relief. Nathaniel found the accounting document that evening. Elizabeth was in the sitting room when she heard him cross the hall and stop. She had left the study door open. She heard the sound of paper, the particular stillness of a man reading something that requires his full attention, and then footsteps, deliberate ones, coming toward the sitting room. He appeared in the doorway. She looked up from her sewing. He held the document in both hands. His face had the expression of a man who has just encountered a wall he was not expecting. "Where did you get these numbers?" he said. "From the ledgers," she said. "And from Caldwell's quarterly reports. I compared them line by line. The methodology is noted in the margin of the second page. He looked down at the document again, back at her. You did this today. I did. Elizabeth. He paused, seemed to recalibrate. This is if these numbers are right. They're right, she said without apology. Check them yourself if you want to be certain, but they're right. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the flat inattention she had grown so accustomed to. Not the polite disconnection of the evenings when he passed through rooms she occupied without really entering them. Something else. Something closer to seeing. She held his gaze and did not look away because she was done looking away. I'll speak with Caldwell in the morning, he said finally. That seems wise, she said, and returned to her sewing. He stood in the doorway for another moment, long enough that she was aware of it, long enough that she knew he was still there, and then he left. She set the sewing down in her lap and sat very still in the quiet room. Her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to shake. They were steady. Thursday came, and Elizabeth went to the south boundary with young Thomas from the stable, who was 16 and earnest and knew everyone on the tenant farms by name. The Darcy family gave her a corner of their barn and 3 benches and a look of combined gratitude and bewilderment. And Elizabeth sat down in front of 8 children, ranging from 6 to 13, and taught her first lesson. She taught them the alphabet. She taught them to write their names. She taught the older 2, a boy named Henry and a girl named Cora, the beginning of long division, because both of them were quick and hungry for it, in the way that some children are when they have been given the taste of a thing they didn't know they needed. She rode back to Brooks Valley in the late afternoon with chalk dust on her sleeve and something in her chest that she could only describe as being the opposite of invisible. Nathaniel was at the gate when the horse came in. He was not waiting for her, or at least he appeared not to be. He was speaking with one of the grooms about something to do with the fence along the east pasture. But he looked up when she rode in, and his eyes tracked her as she dismounted. You went to the south boundary, he said. I did. Teaching. Yes. She handed Thomas the reins and turned toward the house. Elizabeth. She stopped. Turned. He was still standing at the gate, one hand on the post, looking at her with that unsettled expression she had started to identify as the specific look of a man whose categories are being disrupted. You could have told me, he said, what you were planning. She considered this for a moment. I didn't need your permission, she said pleasantly, and went inside. She heard later that he had confronted Caldwell the following morning and terminated the land agent's contract by the afternoon. She heard it from Mrs. Hale, who had heard it from the stablemaster, who had apparently witnessed the whole thing from the fence line, and reported that Nathaniel Brooks had been very quiet and very certain throughout, in the way that made it much worse than if he had shouted. She did not hear it from Nathaniel. He did not come to tell her himself. She told herself she was not bothered by this. She was a little, but less than she would have been a month ago. Less, she realized, than she would have been even 2 weeks ago, before the morning she had sat up in bed before dawn and made her quiet decision. The thing about deciding to stop disappearing, she was learning, was that it worked forward as well as backward. It did not just change what you did next. It changed how much the old things could still reach you. She went to the south boundary on Thursday and again on Saturday, and Henry and Cora were both waiting at the barn door when she arrived, and Henry had practiced the division problems in the dirt and showed her with a pride so genuine and uncomplicated that she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was Mrs. Hartfield who first said something directly. They met at the dry goods store in the village on a Thursday morning in late July. Both of them there for the same bolts of autumn fabric that had come in on the wagon from Richmond. Mrs. Brooks, said Mrs. Hartfield, who was 60 and had been in the county her entire life, and said what she thought with the serene confidence of a woman who had outlasted enough scandal to know that most of it didn't matter. You look different. Do I? Elizabeth set a bolt of gray wool back on the shelf. You do. You look... Mrs. Hartfield studied her with the frank assessment of a woman taking careful inventory. You look like someone who stopped waiting for something. Elizabeth looked at her. I suppose I have, she said. Mrs. Hartfield nodded slowly, The way people nod when they are filing something important into permanent storage. "Good," she said. "It suits you." The children's reading program was what people in the village noticed first. Word traveled the way it always did in a small county through church and market, and the particular social telegraph of women talking over garden fences. And by the third week, 2 mothers from the village proper had appeared at Elizabeth's teaching sessions, asking if their children might join. By the 4th week, there were 14 students, and Elizabeth had recruited a young schoolteacher from the village, a Miss Agnes Pryor, to help on Saturdays. What Elizabeth had not anticipated was the way this changed how people spoke to her. She had been Mrs. Brooks for 2 years, which was its own kind of identity, respectable and defined and bounded by her husband's name and her husband's property, and the expectations that came with both. People had always been pleasant to her in the way that people in a small county are pleasant to the wife of a man who owns a substantial portion of the land. But that was courtesy, that was navigation. What she was getting now in the market, and at the church steps, and in the small exchanges of a summer community going about its daily life, was something different. People were asking her opinion. They were bringing her problems, not the decorative kind of problem that gets brought to a prominent household wife, but the real kind. Farmers asking whether she had any thoughts on how to present a disputed acreage claim. Women asking whether she knew the legal standing of a debt that had been handled informally. A young couple from the north end of the county who had heard she understood figures and wanted to know if she could look at a contract they'd been given before they signed it. She understood gradually that she had been useful before, but she had been useful in the way of a resource, something drawn on and then set back in place. This was different. She was being seen. Not by Nathaniel. Not yet, or not in the way that would have mattered once when she had organized her entire emotional life around the specific project of being visible to one man. By the people around her, and what she was discovering slowly. The way you discover a truth that has been sitting in plain sight was that it felt completely different from what she had imagined. She had thought that being seen would feel like being chosen. It felt instead like being real. Nathaniel noticed. He would have had to be made of stone not to notice. The house was different, not in any way he could have named precisely if someone had asked him, but different in the particular way that a space changes when the person who inhabits it has changed. Quieter in some ways, more purposeful in others. He came down to dinner one evening to find Elizabeth already at the table, still in her day dress with a letter open beside her plate and the focused expression of someone in the middle of solving something. "The Greer family," she said without looking up. "The widow on the Eastern Road. Her husband left the property deed in his name only, and she doesn't know how to establish her claim. I've been writing to my father's attorney in Charlottesville." He sat down. That's not your responsibility," he said, though the words felt wrong even as he said them. She looked up. "No," she agreed with a pleasantness that had a very precise edge to it. "But someone should help her, and she came to me." He looked at her across the table. He looked at her. Really looked the way he had not looked at her in a long time. Perhaps had never looked at her with the full weight of his attention. And he saw for the first time in a way that landed what he was actually looking at. Not a woman performing the role of wife. A woman with opinions and skills and a set of purposes that had nothing to do with him. A woman who had been there all along. The dinner passed in something that was not quite conversation, but was more than they had managed in months. He asked a question about the Greer deed. She answered it and then asked one back. He answered. They discussed it with the careful attention of 2 people discovering with some surprise that they could discuss something together. He walked back to his study that evening with the unsettled feeling of someone who has just realized in the middle of a room they've walked through 100 times that there is a door they've never opened. He told himself it meant nothing in particular. He did not entirely believe it. It was the Tuesday of the 3rd week of August when Elizabeth went to the village and stopped outside the bookstore to look at a pamphlet in the window. A new agricultural text she'd heard mentioned something about soil management practices from the New England farming societies, and heard her name called from across the street. Mrs. Brooks. She turned. A man she had seen perhaps twice before was crossing toward her. Samuel Reed, who had opened the bookshop the previous spring, and had apparently come from Philadelphia, where he had studied law for 2 years before deciding he preferred books to courtrooms. He was perhaps 30, with an easy way of walking, and the kind of face that suggested he found most situations genuinely interesting rather than performing interest as a social courtesy. "I heard about the reading program," he said, stopping a respectable distance away and tipping his hat. "Agnes Pryor told me. I wanted to offer if it would be useful. I have texts at the shop that would suit the older students. You'd be welcome to borrow them at no cost." "That's very generous," Elizabeth said. "I'd be glad to take you up on that. Come in if you have a moment. I'll show you what I have." She went in. The bookshop was one room and smelled of paper and linseed oil, and the particular dusty piece of a space organized around the idea that knowledge matters. She spent an hour there. She had not meant to spend an hour, had intended 5 minutes going through the shelves that Samuel Reed pointed out with the straightforward enthusiasm of a person sharing something he genuinely loved. He was easy to talk to. That was the simple fact of it. He was easy to talk to in the way that some people are easy to talk to, not because they are performing ease, but because they are genuinely curious and not performing anything at all. He asked her about the program. She told him. He asked about the children, specifically what they were learning, what they struggled with, what delighted them. She answered, and found herself saying things she had not said aloud before, things she had been thinking about in the teaching sessions, observations about how children learned ideas she had for the next term. He listened. Not the polite listening of social courtesy, the actual kind. When she left the bookshop with 4 borrowed volumes under her arm, and the very good feeling of having had a real conversation, she walked to the carriage thinking, "This is what it feels like. This is what it feels like when someone is actually paying attention." She thought it without grief. That surprised her. She did not mention Samuel Reed to Nathaniel. There was nothing to mention. She had borrowed books from a bookshop and had a conversation about her teaching program, and these were not events that required reporting. She had long since stopped organizing her days around the question of what Nathaniel would think of them. But she thought about the conversation on the ride home, and she thought about it again in the quiet of the evening, and what she thought about it was not the conversation itself, not Samuel Reed's easy questions or the good smell of the bookshop, but the contrast. She thought about what it meant that an hour of conversation with a man she barely knew had made her feel more present, more substantial, more genuinely herself than 2 years of marriage had managed. She was not angry. She had moved, she realized through anger some weeks back, without fully marking the moment. What she felt now was something quieter and more clarifying. She was not the problem. She had never been the problem. She had been pouring herself into a vessel that had a crack in it, and no amount of patience or loyalty or blue dresses carefully made would have filled it, because the crack was not in her. She had been so certain for so long that if she were only enough patient, enough capable, enough good enough, she could make a man see her who had simply never chosen to look. She had been wrong. She set that knowledge down carefully, the way you set down something breakable that you are relieved to finally be able to put on a shelf. She was 24 years old. She was already against the odds, and without anyone's particular help becoming someone worth knowing. That would have to be enough. For now, it was more than enough. It was everything. The 4 borrowed books from Samuel Reed's shop sat on Elizabeth's writing desk for 3 days before Nathaniel noticed them. She knew the exact moment he did, because she heard him stop in the doorway of the sitting room on a Wednesday evening, and she heard the particular quality of that stop. Not the usual passing pause of a man moving through his own house, but the stillness of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding what to do about it. "Those are new," he said. "Borrowed," she said without looking up from the one she was reading. "From the bookshop in the village. Mr. Reed had texts appropriate for the older students." A beat. "Reed," Nathaniel said. "The man from Philadelphia." "That's right." Another beat longer this time. "You spoke with him." "I did. He offered the books when he heard about the reading program. It seemed foolish to refuse." She turned a page. "They're good texts. Henry has already worked through the first chapter of the arithmetic one. He's faster than I expected." She heard Nathaniel shift his weight in the doorway. She heard him decide something and then not say it. "Good night," he said instead. "Good night," she replied. She kept her eyes on the page until she heard his footsteps move away down the hall, and then she looked up at the dark window and allowed herself one small moment of noticing. Noticing that he had asked. Noticing that something in the question had an edge to it that was new. Noticing that she felt absolutely no obligation to accommodate that edge. This was new too. She returned to the book. The Greer widow's deed situation resolved on a Friday in late August, and Elizabeth was there when it did. She had spent the better part of 3 weeks corresponding with her father's attorney in Charlottesville, a careful and meticulous man named Mr. Aldous, who had handled Carter family affairs for 20 years, and who wrote letters with the dense precision of a man who understood that words on paper had the power to protect people. He had reviewed the situation, confirmed Elizabeth's reading of the relevant law, and provided her with a specific argument regarding the widow's claim that he wrote should hold up before any reasonable magistrate in the Commonwealth. Elizabeth went to Mrs. Greer's farm herself. She brought the letter. She sat at the widow's kitchen table, a small scrubbed table that bore the evidence of years of careful use, and she walked Mrs. Greer through what it said and what it meant and what the next step was. Mrs. Greer was 63 years old. She had worked that farm with her husband for 38 years and had never once had cause to understand the difference between a deed in joint tenancy and a deed in sole ownership, because it had never mattered until it mattered entirely. She listened to Elizabeth with the focused attention of a woman whose whole future had recently been condensed into a single legal document. When Elizabeth finished, Mrs. Greer was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My daughter told me to come to you, said you'd know what to do." "Your daughter was kind to say so." "She wasn't being kind." Mrs. Greer looked at her steadily. "She was being accurate. There's a difference." Elizabeth rode back to Brooks Valley with that sentence living somewhere warm in her chest. She wasn't being kind. She was being accurate. She turned it over on the ride home, the way you turn over a stone that has something interesting underneath it. She was becoming without particularly planning to someone that people brought their real problems to, not their decorative problems, not the social problems of who to invite and how to arrange a table. The kind that kept people awake in the night and that left unaddressed could take a person's farm or their future or their ability to feed their children. Those problems. And she was handling them not perfectly, not without uncertainty, but handling them with the particular competence of a woman who had been told her whole life to make herself smaller, and had quietly, stubbornly kept her full capacity intact anyway. She wondered, riding past the east field as the late August light went copper over the tobacco rows, what her life would have looked like if she had started doing this 2 years ago. She stopped wondering about it almost immediately. The past 2 years had been what they'd been. She was not going to spend the next 2 looking backward. Nathaniel confronted her about the Greer situation on a Saturday morning, and it did not go the way he had apparently expected it to. She was in the study, his study, which she had begun using during the mornings when he was out, because it had the best light and the largest desk, and there was no sensible reason not to use it when she heard him come in from the fields earlier than usual. She heard the boot scrape at the door, the hat on the hook, the pause when he registered that the study door was open and someone was in it. He appeared in the doorway. She looked up from the Greer correspondence she was organizing. "You went to see Eleanor Greer," he said, not a question. "I did." "Elizabeth." He came into the room and stopped on the other side of the desk, and she noticed she was always noticing things. It was one of the things about her that she had stopped apologizing for, that he did not know where to put his hands. He crossed his arms, then dropped them, then put one hand on the back of the chair. "That situation involves a property dispute, a legal matter. You could have told me, and I would have handled it." "You would have," she said. "Of course. I've known about the Greer deed since June," she said. "I mentioned it to Mrs. Hale, who I assumed would mention it where it might be useful. No one handled it, so I did." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the complete, steady attention of a woman who has stopped performing deference. "You wrote to an attorney," he said, "without consulting me." "I wrote to my father's attorney," she said, "with my own correspondence. about a neighbor's legal situation that had nothing to do with your estate. She paused just one beat. Is there a part of that which requires your approval? The silence that followed was the kind that has a great deal happening inside it. She watched him work through something she could see it, the internal navigation of a man encountering a version of his wife he had not prepared for and did not have a ready response to. He was not an unintelligent man. She had always known that. What she was discovering was that his intelligence had been almost entirely directed outward toward land and figures and business, and very rarely turned on the things closest to him. I'm not trying to undermine you, she said, and her voice was even because she meant it genuinely and was not performing gentleness. I'm not making a point about your management of the estate. I saw a woman in a difficult situation, and I had the knowledge to help her. That's all. He stood there for another moment. Then he said very quietly, "How did you know the legal argument?" And she told him. Clearly, precisely the way she would explain anything, the distinction in property law, the specific precedent Mr. Aldous had cited, the reason it would hold. She watched his expression change as she spoke. Not soften exact. That wasn't the right word for Nathaniel, but open in the way that a window opens when someone who's been in a closed room finally reaches for the latch. When she finished, he was quiet. "That's thorough," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He left the study without another word, but he left it differently than he'd entered it, and she knew the difference, even if she couldn't have put a name to it. September arrived, and with it the particular quality of Virginia. Late summer, the air still hot at midday, but carrying something cooler in the mornings. A first suggestion of what was coming. The tobacco in the south field, beginning to show the deep gold of a good harvest year. Elizabeth's teaching sessions had grown to 17 students. Miss Agnes Pryor was now coming 4 days a week instead of 1, and Elizabeth had written to a women's educational society in Richmond that she had read about in one of the pamphlets from Samuel Reed's shop. She had written formally on good paper, describing the program's scope and student population and the specific gaps in available materials, and she had asked for advice on curriculum, and very directly for any donated texts the society might have available for distribution. She had not asked Nathaniel's permission to write the letter. She had not asked anyone's permission. She told Mrs. Hale about it at breakfast one morning because Mrs. Hale had become, over the course of these weeks, something that Elizabeth had not expected and valued enormously. A person who paid genuine attention and whose responses were consistently worth having. "Richmond," Mrs. Hale said. "The Women's Society. They've been running programs in the city for 6 years. They know more about this than I do." Mrs. Hale was quiet for a moment, in the specific way that meant she was deciding whether to say something. "He knows," she said finally. Elizabeth looked at her. "Mr. Brooks," Mrs. Hale said with the precise economy of a woman who understood her position and operated just at the edge of it. "He asks. In the mornings when you've already gone out. He asks where you've been." Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. "What do you tell him?" "The truth," Mrs. Hale said. "The teaching. The Greer situation. The letter to Richmond." A pause. "He listens. He doesn't say much, but he listens." Elizabeth stood up and took her cup to the window. Outside the morning was going gold over the east field. The same east field she had watched every morning for 2 years, waiting for the day to deliver something different. It was delivering something different now, just not in the direction she had once imagined. "Good," she said simply, and went to get her shawl for the ride to the south boundary. The first time she saw Samuel Reed outside the bookshop was at the village market on a Thursday morning in early September, and it happened in front of enough people that it became, in the particular social economy of a small Virginia county, a thing that was noticed. She was at the dry goods table, examining a bolt of muslin, when she heard his voice behind her, and she turned to find him standing with a look of genuine pleasure that had nothing calculated about it. The look of a person who has run into someone they actually wanted to see. "Mrs. Brooks, how is Henry getting on with the arithmetic text?" "He's finished it," she said, "and he's bored, which means he's ready for the next one." Samuel Reed laughed a real laugh, easy and unguarded. "I have exactly what he needs. Come by the shop when you have a chance, and I'll set it aside." "I'll come Friday," she said. "I'm bringing Cora as well. She's ready for something more challenging in the reading." "Bring them both," he said. "I'd like to meet them." They talked for perhaps 10 minutes, standing at the market in the September morning, discussing the children and the program, and a specific question Henry had asked that Elizabeth had found she didn't quite know how to answer about why different counties had different rules for land claims, which turned into a genuine conversation about Virginia law and the specific complications of the western boundary settlements, a subject Samuel Reed knew considerably more about than she had expected. She was not performing interest. She was genuinely interested. That was the thing about talking to Samuel Reed. The conversation was always actually about the thing it appeared to be about. There was no subtext requiring management, no social obligation requiring performance. He said what he thought. She said what she thought. The exchange was direct and easy and real. She said goodbye and walked to the carriage and was already thinking about the question Henry had asked and whether there was a way to teach it that would make it concrete rather than abstract. And it was not until she was halfway home that she registered someone had been watching. She turned the thought over carefully. She registered it. She set it down. She returned to thinking about Henry. What she did not know, what she would not know until much later, when Mrs. Hartfield told her with the frank specificity of a woman who saw no reason to be vague about important events, was that Nathaniel had ridden into the village that same morning. He had business at the grain merchant's, which was 2 buildings down from the dry goods table, and he had come around the corner just as she and Samuel Reed were deep in conversation about Virginia land law, both of them leaning slightly forward in the particular posture of people who are genuinely engaged. He had stopped. He had stood there for long enough to understand what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was his wife, the woman who for 2 years had followed 3 steps behind him through every social occasion, who had waited at the edge of every conversation. For the moment, he might acknowledge her standing in the public market, talking to another man with the easy comfort of someone who had never in her life needed to wait for anything. She was smiling. Not the careful smile of a woman performing grace under difficult circumstances. The unrehearsed kind, the kind that starts in the eyes before the mouth catches up. He had seen that smile exactly once before the day she arrived at Brooks Valley after their wedding, when she had stepped out of the carriage and seen the garden in full summer bloom and turned to say something to the housewoman, and her whole face had been open, unguarded, alive with a delight she wasn't managing. He had noticed it then and filed it somewhere without examining it. He was examining it now from 20 yards away, watching another man be the reason for it. He turned around and went back to the grain merchant without completing his errand, and he rode back to Brooks Valley in the kind of silence that is not peaceful, and he spent the afternoon at the fence line doing work that did not require thought, so that his hands had something to do while his mind worked through what his body had already understood. He had not lost his wife to another man. He had not lost her at all. In the ordinary sense, she was still in his house, still managing his household accounts, still teaching children on his land, still sitting across from him at dinner, with the steady, composed attention of a woman who had decided exactly who she was and no longer required his confirmation of it. But something had shifted. Something had been lost or given away, or perhaps simply revealed as never having been his to begin with. He had spent 2 years taking for granted a woman he had never bothered to know. And now he was watching someone else know her in the space of a 10-minute conversation at a market stall. And the thing that sat in his chest as he rode back was not anger. He had looked at it carefully to make sure, because he was a man who had always trusted his own judgment, and he needed to be honest. It was not anger. It was fear. He found her in the library that evening. She was reading by the lamp one of Reed's borrowed books, though he did not know that, or perhaps he did, and said nothing with her legs curled beneath her in the chair, in the way she only sat when she thought she was alone, the way he had glimpsed sometimes through a half-open door and always turned away from, as if he had no right to it. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "Nathaniel," she said with the mild attention of someone marking a page. "Did you need something from the library?" "No," he said. I thought we might talk." She waited with a patience that was entirely different from the patience she had once performed. Not the waiting of a woman hoping for a particular outcome, but the simple neutral waiting of a woman who has nowhere else she needs to be, and no particular investment in which direction this goes. That patience undid something in him. "The harvest figures are better than Caldwell's projections," he said. Not what he had meant to say, but it came out first because he was a man who defaulted to practicality when emotion required navigation. "Your accounting work, the discrepancies you found were recovering the yield that was being skimmed. I should have told you." "You didn't need to tell me," she said. "I could see it in the quarterly reports." Nevertheless, he came further into the room and stood near the other chair, not sitting, standing near it with the cautious energy of a man who is not entirely sure of his footing. "You were right, about Caldwell, about the numbers, about all of it." She looked at him steadily. "Nathaniel," she said, and her voice was entirely without performance. "What did you want to talk about?" A long pause. He sat down. "I saw you today," he said. "In the village, with Reed." She held his gaze and said nothing, because she understood that he needed to arrive at whatever this was on his own, and because she had nothing to apologize for and no intention of beginning to. "You seemed—" He stopped, seemed to be choosing something carefully. "I have not seen you like that in some time." "Like what?" The question was direct, unhurried. She asked it the way she asked everything now, simply without loading it with hope or strategy. He looked at his hands. "Happy," he said. Just the one word. The silence that followed it had a different texture from the silences they usually shared. Not the silence of two people in separate rooms who happen to occupy the same house, but the silence of two people who are finally in the same room and both know it. "I have been happy," she said carefully, "these past weeks." "I know." He looked up. "And I understand that I have not been the reason." She did not deny it. He stood up from the chair and walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched him. The set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried the weight of a realization he hadn't prepared for, and then he turned. "I have not been a good husband to you," he said, quietly, without decoration. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "You haven't." He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he needed confirmed. "I don't know how to fix that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." And she returned to her book, not in dismissal. She was not performing coolness, but because she had meant it exactly, and there was nothing further to say tonight, and she had learned in the past weeks to stop filling silences that were better left to do their work. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he said very quietly, "Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night," she said. She heard him leave. She heard his footsteps down the hall slower than usual, carrying something. She listened until the sound was gone, and then she sat in the lamp-lit library and let herself feel what was actually happening, not what she wanted to be happening. Not the story she might have told herself 6 weeks ago, but what was actually there. He was seeing her. Finally, after 2 years, he was beginning to see her. And she did not know. She genuinely did not know. And this was perhaps the most honest thing about her, whether it was too late. She told her father in a letter that week. She had been writing to her father regularly, more regularly than before, because she had more to write about, because she was living in 3 dimensions again, instead of the single flat one she had reduced herself to in the first 2 years of the marriage. Her father was a practical man, a farmer and a reader, who had raised her to think and had watched her marry Nathaniel Brooks, with the specific quiet worry of a man who trusted his daughter's judgment and was not entirely certain the match warranted it. She did not tell him everything in the letter. She told him about the teaching program, about the Greer deed, about the correspondence with the Richmond Women's Society. She told him that she had been using the skills he taught her. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I think I had forgotten for a while that those skills were mine. I remember now." She sealed the letter and gave it to Thomas for the post, and she went back inside, feeling lighter than she had felt in 2 years. Not happy in the uncomplicated way of someone whose problems have been resolved, but lighter. Like someone who has finally set down a weight she had been carrying for so long, she had stopped noticing its shape. The Richmond Society wrote back in the 3rd week of September. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was downstairs in the particular private pleasure of a response that has exceeded what you dared to hope for. The Society's director, a woman named Mrs. Lena Fairfax, had written 3 pages. 3 careful, engaged, knowledgeable pages, responding to Elizabeth's curriculum questions, with specific recommendations, citing the approaches they had found most effective in their city programs, and flagging the particular challenges of rural student populations that Elizabeth had described. She had also included, folded into the letter, a list of 14 donated texts that were available for immediate shipment, and a personal note at the bottom of the final page that read, "Your program sounds precisely the kind of work we wish to support. I hope this is the beginning of a correspondence." Elizabeth read that note 3 times. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet of Brooks Valley, and read it 3 times, and felt the particular overwhelm of a person who has asked for something genuinely and been genuinely answered. Mrs. Hale found there 20 minutes later. "You're smiling at a letter," Mrs. Hale observed. "I am," Elizabeth agreed. "Good news." "Very." Elizabeth looked up. "Mrs. Hale, I'm going to need to build some shelves." Mrs. Hale blinked. "Shelves? For the books. 14 volumes are coming from Richmond, and there's nowhere adequate to keep them at the South Boundary barn. The children need a proper space." She folded the letter with the careful attention of something being put in a safe place. "I'd like to talk to Thomas about the timber we have from the North operation. There should be sufficient material." Mrs. Hale stood in this kitchen doorway for a moment, with the expression of someone who has just watched a line of thinking arrive at a destination they should have anticipated and didn't. "I'll send Thomas to you after breakfast," she said. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, and went to write back to Mrs. Lena Fairfax. She was composing the reply letter in the study when Nathaniel came in from his morning ride. She heard him in the hall, the boot scrape and the hat, and she heard the way his steps changed when he registered the study light. A slight pause, a recalibration, and then he appeared in the doorway with his riding coat still on, and the outdoor smell of September morning coming in with him. He looked at her at the desk, the letter under her hand, the pen in her other hand. He did not say, "What are you doing?" or "May I?" or anything else that would have required her to justify herself. "I'm writing to the Women's Educational Society in Richmond," she said. "They're sending 14 texts for the program. I'd like to build shelves at the South Boundary to house them properly." She met his eyes directly. "I'll need to access the timber from the North operation. I'm asking because it's your material." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "How much do you need? Thomas will know better than I do. I'd say roughly enough for 2 6-foot shelving units." "Tell Thomas to take what's needed," he said, "and to bring Rory from the carpenter's side to help him do it right." She looked at him. Something in the quality of the look they exchanged in that moment was different from anything they had managed in 2 years of the same house and the same dinner table and the same careful orbit around each other. It wasn't warmth exactly. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something simpler and in its way more substantial. It was the recognition of 2 people who are for the first time actually talking to each other. "Thank you," she said. "Elizabeth." He stopped. Something moved across his face that she had begun cautiously to read, the expression of a man working toward something without his usual confidence in the destination. "I was thinking about coming to the South Boundary. When you teach. Not to observe or interfere. Just to see what you've built there." She held his gaze. "Come Thursday," she said. "We start at 9. He nodded. He left the study, and she listened to his footsteps go toward the back of the house, and she sat at the desk for a long moment with the pen in her hand and the letter half written and the September morning coming in through the window. She did not know what Thursday would bring. She did not know what Nathaniel Brooks was becoming, whether this was the beginning of a genuine change or the temporary discomfort of a man who had glimpsed something he wanted back without understanding what returning it would actually cost him. She was not waiting to find out. She was going to keep building what she was building and living the life she was assembling from its very beginning, and whatever Nathaniel chose to do or not do would be his choice and his consequence. She returned to Mrs. Fairfax's letter and wrote until the morning was full around her. Outside, Somewhere in the east field, she could hear the harvest hands starting their work, voices carrying in the clear September air, the sound of labor and ordinary life, and a world that was entirely indifferent to the particular drama of one woman finding at 24, in a Virginia farmhouse in the summer of 1816, the shape of herself. She found it was a good shape. She kept writing. Thursday came in cool and clear, the kind of September morning that made Virginia feel like a promise being kept. Elizabeth was already in the barn at the south boundary when she heard the horse. She knew it was him before she turned around, knew it from the particular cadence of the hoofbeats, the way he rode, unhurried and deliberate, the same way he did everything. She kept her attention on Cora, who was working through a reading passage with the focused intensity of a child who has decided that failing in front of someone is not an option. "Sounded it out," Elizabeth said. "You know those letters." "Constitution," Cora said slowly, then again faster, testing it. "Constitution. That's right. Do you know what it means?" "It's the law," Cora said. "The big one, the one nobody can break." "Exactly right." She heard Nathaniel dismount behind her. She heard him loop the reins over the post. She heard his boots on the packed earth as he came to the barn entrance, and she heard him stop there, and she did not turn around. She taught the next 20 minutes, the way she always taught, directly, with full attention on the children, asking questions that required real thinking, correcting mistakes without fuss, praising accuracy without performance. Henry demonstrated the division problems he had mastered. Two of the younger ones practiced their letters on the small chalkboard Thomas had rigged to the wall. The Darcy girl, who was only 6, but could already read at a level that astonished everyone, including Elizabeth, asked what came after multiplication. "Fractions," Elizabeth said. The Darcy girl looked delighted, in the way of a child who has just been given permission to keep going. When the session ended and the children filed out, several of them noticing Nathaniel at the entrance with the frank, open stares of children who have not yet learned to pretend they don't see things, Elizabeth finally turned. Howe was still standing where he had stopped. He had not moved in 20 minutes. She could not read his expression with complete certainty, but there was something in it she had not seen in 2 years of living in the same house with this man. He looked struck. "That's Henry," he said. "The boy who finished the arithmetic text." "Yes. He's quick. He's exceptional," she said. "If he were the son of a landowner, he'd be at a proper school already. He's got the mind for law or medicine or anything else he chose." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You got all of this started yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did." He looked around the barn. The shelves Thomas and Rory had built, still smelling of fresh-cut timber, the 14 Richmond volumes arranged with the particular neatness of something Elizabeth had organized herself. The chalkboard, the benches, the stacked slates, the children used for practice. "It took me 6 weeks to get the north fence repaired," he said almost to himself. "You built a school." "It's a barn with shelves," she said. "Elizabeth." He looked at her. "It's a school." She held his gaze for a moment, and then picked up her satchel, because she was not going to dissolve at a compliment, even a deserved one, even from him. And she had learned in the past months that the steadiest thing she could do for herself was to receive acknowledgement without either deflecting it or leaning into it too hard. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I need to get back." He walked with her to the horses. He did not fill the silence with words, which was, she was realizing, one of the only things about Nathaniel Brooks that had never required correction. He understood the weight of quiet. They rode back toward Brooks Valley with the fields on either side, going gold in the late morning light. And it was not a comfortable silence between them, not yet, but it was an honest one, and honest was more than they had managed in a long time. At the gate he said, "May I come again next Thursday?" She considered him for one moment. "If you want to come, come," she said. "But come to learn something. The children don't need an audience." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, with the particular composure of a man who is used to being in charge and is deciding when that is and isn't applicable. "Understood," he said. What happened at the community harvest supper 3 days later was not something Elizabeth had anticipated, and that was, she would think afterward, entirely the point. The supper was held at the Hartfield property, a long table in the yard. 20-odd people from the county. The informal gathering that closed out the harvest season every year with food and music, and the particular warmth of people who have worked the same land through the same summer and are now sitting down together on the other side of it. Elizabeth arrived with Mrs. Hale, who had decided at the last moment to come, which was itself unusual enough that Elizabeth noted it. Nathaniel had said he would ride over later. He had a final survey of the north field to complete before dark. Samuel Reed was there. She had not known he would be. She did not know his social calendar. They were not close in the way that required that kind of knowledge, but she was not surprised. He had been over the past weeks becoming more integrated into the county's social life in the easy way of a man who is genuinely interested in people, and whom people therefore genuinely liked. He found her near the long table, and they fell into conversation, the way they always did, immediately about something specific, without the preliminary performance of social courtesy that most conversations required. He had received a pamphlet from the Philadelphia Education Society about a new approach to teaching reading comprehension to children who were working in a second language, and he thought it might be relevant to two of Elizabeth's students whose families had German origins. "I'd like to see it," she said. "I'll bring it Thursday," he said. "I was thinking of asking whether I might come to one of the sessions, not to interfere, just to observe. I have some thoughts about the older students and what might be available to them after they've finished your curriculum." "Come Thursday," she said. "I've already told one person to come Thursday and learn something rather than just watch. You'll fit the same requirement." He laughed. "Who's the other one?" "My husband," she said without any particular weight on it. Something in Samuel Reed's expression became very slightly more careful, in the way of a man who is intelligent and has been paying attention to things he hasn't commented on. "Is he coming around?" he asked. "He's trying," she said. "Whether that amounts to something is a question I don't have the answer to yet." "Fair enough," he said with a simplicity she appreciated. They were standing close enough to each other that their conversation was quiet, the natural closeness of two people talking under the noise of a larger gathering, and they were both leaning forward slightly in the posture of people who are engaged with what the other person is saying, and Elizabeth was in the middle of saying something about the German origin students when she felt a change in the air to her left. She turned. Nathaniel was standing 10 feet away. He had arrived without her hearing him. The music from the far end of the table had covered the sound, and he had been standing there for long enough to take in the full picture of what he was looking at. His face was arranged in the composed, unreadable expression that she had once spent considerable effort trying to decode, but she knew him better now than she had known him even a month ago, and what she read under the composure was something she had never seen on his face before. He was not angry. He was afraid. She recognized it because she had felt it herself, that specific fear, not of a person, but of a situation. The fear of realizing that something you had treated as permanent was in fact fragile, and that the fragility was entirely your own making. "Nathaniel," she said in the same even tone she used for everything now. He crossed the distance between them with the deliberate stride of a man who is keeping himself in check, and he tipped his hat to Samuel Reed with the precise courtesy of a Virginia gentleman who has been raised to perform courtesy regardless of what he is feeling, which meant that what he said next, not to Reed but to Elizabeth, quietly cost him something. "You look well," he said. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing to say. But she heard what was the acknowledgement, the recognition, the three words doing the work of a great many more, and she chose not to let it pass entirely. "Thank you," she said. "You know Mr. Reed. We've met." Nathaniel extended a hand, and Reed took it, and there was a moment between the two men that was entirely civil and almost entirely about something other than civility. "Your wife's program is remarkable," Samuel Reed said with the direct simplicity of a man who says what he means. "Those children are going to have opportunities because of her that they would not otherwise have had." Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." The supper continued, and Elizabeth moved through it, the way she moved through everything now present, purposeful, without the anxious monitoring of her husband's position and attention that had once occupied the background of every social occasion. She talked with Mrs. Hartfield about the Richmond Society's letter. She talked with two of the tenant farmers' wives about which of the children had shown the most progress. She accepted a second serving of the apple preserves that Mrs. Darcy had brought because they were excellent and she wanted them. Nathaniel stayed. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, not watching it constantly, but knowing it's there, knowing the temperature of it, reading the changes. He talked with the other landowners. He ate. He listened to the fiddle player from the far end of the yard. He was in the external performance of it exactly what he had always been at these gatherings, composed, respected, present. But he kept finding her with his eyes, not possessively, not with the proprietary attention of a man marking territory, with something quieter and harder to name, the attention of a person who has realized too late that they have not been looking and is now trying to make up for it by looking at everything, cataloging it, as if seeing it now could retroactively repair not seeing it before. She did not seek out those glances. She did not avoid them either. When the music started up properly, and the dancing began at the yard's edge, she was standing with Agnes Pryor discussing the autumn teaching schedule when Samuel Reed appeared beside her. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "will you dance?" She looked at him. There was nothing complicated in the invitation. It was a harvest supper. There was a fiddle. People were dancing, and he was asking the way any man might ask a woman he knew at a social occasion. There was no subtext she needed to manage. She said yes. She said yes because she wanted to dance, because she had not danced in 2 years, because the music was good and the evening was pleasant, and she was a woman who had recently rediscovered that she was allowed to want things. She was aware she would not lie to herself about this, that Nathaniel was watching. She was aware of it, and she danced anyway with the easy pleasure of someone doing something uncomplicated and enjoyable. And she did not look at Nathaniel while she danced, because she was not dancing for Nathaniel, and that she understood was the entire point. What she did not see, because her back was to him when it happened, was the moment that Mrs. Hartfield would describe to her 3 weeks later in the particular detail of a woman who had been watching carefully. Nathaniel, standing at the edge of the yard, had watched his wife dance with another man and had gone very still. Not tense, not rigid, but the stillness of someone who has just understood something that cannot be undone by understanding it. And then he had set his cup down on the nearest table and walked to the far side of the yard and stood there alone for several minutes. And when he came back, his face had the look of a man who has had a conversation with himself that he needed to have, and that was not pleasant. Mrs. Hartfield, who had watched Nathaniel Brooks for the better part of 20 years and had always considered him a man of considerable quality and considerable blindness in equal measure, had watched all of this with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered, and she had thought, "There he is. There's the man in there." She did not say this to anyone at the supper. She stored it for later. The ride home from the supper was the first time they had ridden together since Elizabeth could not immediately recall the last time they had ridden together somewhere. The spring before, perhaps. Before the harvest gathering. Before the blue dress. Nathaniel had asked quietly at the edge of the yard, as the evening wound down, whether she would ride back with him. Not in the way he had once said things to her in passing as an administrative matter, but in the way of a man making an actual request. She had said yes. They rode in the dark with the September night around them, crisp and clear, the stars coming out over the fields, and they did not talk immediately, and it was Nathaniel who broke the silence, which was also new. "How long have you known Reed?" he asked. "Since late July," she said. "He offered books for the program. We've spoken perhaps a dozen times." "You like him?" It was not an accusation. She listened for an accusation and didn't find one. "I find him easy to talk to," she said. "He asks real questions and listens to the answers. That's rarer than it should be." The silence that followed had a particular shape to it. The shape of a man sitting with something he has just been told that he already knew. "Elizabeth." His voice was different from usual, not the controlled tone he used for everything. Something with an edge of rawness to it that she had never heard from him. "What I said last week about not knowing how to fix it. I've been thinking about it." She waited. "I have a habit," he said, "of treating the things I value the way I treat the farm. As though proper management is the same as proper care. As though doing things correctly is the same as doing them well." A pause. long enough that she knew he was choosing the next words with the same care he gave to things that mattered. I managed you, for 2 years. I didn't see that was what I was doing. The horses moved through the dark. She listened to the hoofbeats and the night sounds and the weight of what he had just said, and she let it settle before she answered. Do you know what I did every morning for the first year? She said. I made your breakfast and I left it on the table, and I listened for your footsteps, every morning. I told myself you were busy. I told myself you would come. I told myself that if I was patient enough and good enough and useful enough, eventually you would notice. She paused. I was asking you to see me, Nathaniel, every single day, and you never did. I know that now. I know you know it now, she said. That's not the same as having known it then, when it would have made a difference. He absorbed this without flinching. No, he agreed. It isn't. They reached the Brooks Valley gate and rode through, and he helped her dismount in the dark, and his hand was on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Not in the calculated way of a man making a move, but in the instinctive way of a man who has just understood that he does not want to let go. She went inside. She did not look back at him, but she heard him stand at the gate for a long time after in the dark and the September quiet, and she knew he was thinking, and she knew the thinking was real this time, and she also knew with the particular clarity of a woman who has learned to see things as they are rather than as she wishes them to be, that real thinking was not the same as real change, and real change was the only thing that mattered now. The twist came 10 days later, and it came from a direction Elizabeth had not anticipated. She was in the village on a Wednesday morning at the dry goods when she overheard 2 women talking in the narrow space between the shelving units. She was not eavesdropping, there was nowhere to go, and they had not known she was there, and she heard her name before she could make her presence known. Feel for her I do, but Nathaniel Brooks is not a man who changes, said the first voice, which she identified after a moment as belonging to Mrs. Caldwell, the former land agent's wife, whom Elizabeth had always treated with courtesy, and who had apparently not felt obliged to return it. His father was the same, cold as riverstone. The Carter girl thought she could soften him. She hasn't. She seems happy enough now, said the second voice, younger, less certain. She seems busy, Mrs. Caldwell said. That's different. A woman who's busy doesn't have time to think about what she's not getting. She's filling the hole, not fixing it. Elizabeth stood very still. And that Reed man, Mrs. Caldwell continued. You've seen how they talk. It isn't proper the amount of time she well. I'm not saying anything. I'm only saying that Nathaniel Brooks married above himself in terms of character, and that girl deserves better, and all this reading program business is very well, but it doesn't change what goes on in that house. The younger woman said something Elizabeth didn't catch. Mark me, Mrs. Caldwell said. By spring she'll be gone, or she'll be invisible again. Those are the only 2 ways it ends. They moved away. Elizabeth stood in the space between the shelves, and breathed in and breathed out, and waited for the anger to arrive. What arrived instead was something colder and more useful. She was furious. Yes, she was furious. She was a woman of flesh and feeling, and what she had just heard was mean and small, and had been said by someone with a reason to want her diminished, but under the fury was something clearer. The knowledge that Mrs. Caldwell was working from old information. The knowledge that 2 months ago she might have been right. She was not right now. Elizabeth squared her shoulders, walked out from between the shelves, and set her purchases on the counter without looking in the direction of either woman, and she left the dry goods store with the particular composure of someone who has just been handed a reason to prove something and has decided to prove it quietly. She was halfway to the carriage when Samuel Reed fell into step beside her. You look like someone just said something that didn't sit right, he said. Someone did, she said. Do you want to tell me what? She considered. The thing about Samuel Reed was that he did not ask questions. He didn't mean, which meant the question deserved a real answer. Someone suggested that I'm keeping myself busy so I don't have to think about what I'm not getting at home, she said. And that by spring I'll either be gone or invisible again. He was quiet for a moment. And, he said, and I want to know if that's what it looks like, she said. From the outside, to someone who actually knows me. He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him, because she had asked a real question, and she wanted a real answer, and she had learned that Samuel Reed was one of the people in her world who gave them. "It doesn't look like avoidance," he said carefully. "It looks like a woman who found out what she was capable of and decided that was worth pursuing, regardless of what her marriage does or doesn't become." He paused. "Those are very different things. One is running away. The other is running toward." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that from someone who would tell me the truth." "Always," he said simply. They parted at the street and she drove back to Brooks Valley, and she was 3 miles from the gate when the second part of the morning's disruption arrived in the form of a rider coming toward her fast. Thomas from the stable, who pulled up alongside the carriage with the wide-eyed urgency of a boy who has been sent to find someone immediately. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, breathless. "You're needed at the house. Mr. Brooks had a fall from the north fence. The mare shied at something. They say he's not badly hurt, but he asked for you." She said, "Go ahead of me and tell them I'm coming." And she took the reins in both hands and pushed the horse into a pace that covered the remaining distance in half the usual time. Howe was in the study when she arrived, sitting, not lying down, which she took as a good sign, with Rory from the carpenter's side, pressing a cloth to a cut above his right eyebrow, and Mrs. Hale standing nearby with the expression of a woman who has been managing crises for 40 years and will manage this one too. Elizabeth came in fast and stopped just inside the door. "Let me see," she said. Nathaniel looked up at her from the chair. His coat was dusty and there was blood on his temple, and he was holding his left arm with the careful attention of a man in more pain than he intended to show. "It's not serious," he said. "Let me see," she said again, and crossed the room and took Rory's place and gently moved the cloth aside to examine the cut. It was deep enough to need careful cleaning, not deep enough to be dangerous. The arm concerned her more. "Your arm," she said. "Can you move it?" "Yes." He demonstrated, and she saw him contain the wince. "But it hurts." "It's bruised," he said. "I caught myself on the fence rail." She was close to him, closer than she had stood to him voluntarily in months, near enough to see the set of his jaw and the precise way he was holding himself against the pain. She cleaned the cut with the materials Mrs. Hale had already assembled, working with the careful attention she gave to everything, and he was very still while she did it. "Thomas said you asked for me," she said without looking up from the work. "Yes." "Not Mrs. Hale?" "No." She secured the dressing and stepped back and looked at him. He looked back at her with the unguarded directness of a man whose composure has been shaken enough that the performance of it is too costly at the moment. "I wanted you," he said. Simple and plain, the way he sometimes said things when the social machinery was down. "When Thomas found me at the fence, the first thing I thought of was, I wanted you there." She was quiet for a moment, not unmoved. She was not performing steadiness. She was genuinely carefully moved by it, by the plainness of it, by the way it had clearly cost him to say it. But she was also the woman who had stood in a dark garden watching him smile at someone else. She was also the woman who had heard her name in the dry goods store this morning from someone who thought she was either running or diminishing. She was also the woman who had built a school in a barn and written letters to Richmond and helped a widow keep her farm, and she did not put all of that down because her husband was bruised and had said something honest. "I'm glad you're not badly hurt," she said. "Elizabeth." "Rest," she said. "Let Mrs. Hale bring you something to eat and keep the arm still. I'll look at it again tonight." She picked up the supplies. "Thomas is waiting to know you're all right. I'll tell him." She walked out of the study and through the hall and out the front door into the September afternoon. And she stood on the porch with the sun on her face and her hands still and her heart doing something complicated inside her chest. She was not cold. She was not punishing him. She was not performing distance to make a point. She was protecting herself honestly and deliberately, with both eyes open from the particular danger of a woman who has worked very hard to stop disappearing and might be tempted in a vulnerable moment with a bruised man looking at her plainly and saying, "I wanted you to disappear again, just a little, just enough in the direction of something she wanted so badly." She still had to be careful about how close she let herself get to wanting it. She breathed in the September air, She went to tell Thomas that his employer was going to be fine. That evening after dinner, she went back to the study. Nathaniel was there not resting as she had told him to do, because he was not a man who rested easily at the desk, with the harvest ledgers open, using one hand because the other was braced against his side. He looked up when she came in. She did not comment on the fact that he was working. She sat in the chair across from the desk, the one she had begun to think of as hers, and she looked at him. "I want to say something," she said, "and I need you to hear it completely, not just the parts that feel manageable." He set down the pen. "I'm listening," he said. "I spent 2 years in this house trying to earn your attention," she said. "I thought that love was something you proved. I thought that if I waited long enough and worked hard enough and made myself into whatever I thought you needed, that eventually you would look at me the way I needed you to look." She kept her voice even, because this was not a performance of pain, it was the clear-eyed naming of a fact. "I was wrong about that, and the cost of being wrong was 2 years of myself." I was very still. "I'm not the same woman I was in June," she said, "and I'm not going back to being her. Whatever happens between us, whether you change or don't change, whether this marriage becomes something real, or whether we spend the next 20 years being polite to each other across a dinner table, I am not going back." "I don't want you to go back," he said quietly. "I know you don't," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. What you want from me now is not the woman who waited. It's the woman I've become since I stopped waiting. And she is not available to a man who has not done the work of understanding why she had to become her." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what I missed. All of it. I want to know." She looked at him. She looked at the man across the desk, bruised and honest, and asking in the specific way of someone who has decided to stop managing a situation and start inhabiting it. And she understood that this was a different kind of moment from the library, from the gate, from the supper. Those had been him encountering realizations. This was him choosing something. She sat back in the chair and she began to talk, and she did not manage what she said, or soften its edges, or spare him the precise shape of what 2 years of being unseen had felt like from the inside. She talked for a long time, and he listened, not with the polite attention of social courtesy, not with the partial attention of a man waiting for his turn, with the full focused, costly attention of a person who understands that what they are being given is important and irreplaceable. Outside, the September night settled in around Brooks Valley. And inside the study, for the first time in 2 years, Nathaniel Brooks was finally actually paying attention. She talked for nearly 2 hours. Not all of it was hard to say. Some of it came out in the flat, factual tone of someone giving testimony: the breakfasts, the evenings, the harvest gathering, the blue dress. The parts that were easy to name because they had already been named inside her own head 100 times over. She told him those things without flinching and without softening them because he had asked to know, and she had decided he was going to know. The harder parts were the ones she had never put into words before. The morning in the 2nd month of their marriage, when she had stood outside the study door for 20 minutes, working up the nerve to knock and ask if they might ride out together after his morning work, and had finally knocked, and he had looked up from the desk with the absent expression of a man interrupted by something minor, and she had said never mind, and walked away and told herself it didn't matter. She had never told anyone that story. She had barely let herself think it, because thinking it required admitting how small she had made herself in order to fit inside the space he had available for her. Nathaniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer explanations when she described moments that implicated him. He sat in the study chair with his bruised arm rested on the desk and his face open in a way she had never seen. Not soft, not collapsed, but genuinely, causatingly open, like a man who has been locked in a room with accurate information and has nowhere to go except through it. When she finished, they sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "The morning you knocked on the study door, I remember you walking away. I told myself you'd changed your mind about something." "I had," she said. "I'd changed my mind about asking." He absorbed that, said it somewhere careful. "I did that to you," he said. "Not a question, an accounting." "You did?" she said. "Not with cruelty. I want to be honest about that. You didn't hurt me out of spite. You hurt me out of absence. That's almost worse in some ways. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to point at. You were simply never quite there." He was quiet for a long time. "My father," he started, and then stopped. "Tell me," she said. Because she had been talking for 2 hours, and he had listened, and now something in her wanted to give him the same. He looked at his hands. "My father managed this farm and everything on it, including my mother, the same way. With complete competence and complete remove. He provided for her. He was never unkind. He was simply never present in the way that I think she needed, and she learned to stop needing it, or she learned to look like she had." He paused. "I thought that was what a marriage was. I thought that was what a steady man looked like." She heard it fully with the part of her that had been trying to understand him for 2 years and had never quite had enough material to work with. "I understand that," she said, "and I believe you, and it is not an excuse." "I know it isn't. But it is a reason," she said. "And reasons matter to me because I'm not interested in hating you. I'm interested in being honest about what happened." He looked at her. Then, a direct look. The kind that cost him the kind she had stopped expecting from him 6 weeks ago. "What do you need from me?" he asked. She had not expected that question in that form. She had expected apologies or explanations, or the careful social maneuvering of a man trying to find his way back to standing. She had not expected the simple directness of "What do you need?" "I need you to understand that I can't go back," she said. "I keep saying it because I mean it completely. The woman who waited for you at the study door, she is gone. What you have now is someone who will tell you directly what she thinks and what she needs and what she will not tolerate. That is what you get going forward. If that is not something you want, it's what I want," he said, quickly. And then, as if catching himself, "It is what I want. I want to know you, the actual you, not the woman I was expecting you to be." A silence fell between them that was different from the silences they had shared before. Not the cold distance of two people in separate orbits, and not the careful negotiation of two people talking around the real subject, but something more like standing in the same room for the first time. "Then we start there," she said. "We start from honest." He nodded. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said, and stood. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said. She walked out of the study and closed the door quietly behind her, and she stood in the dark hall, with her hand still on the door, and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not resolution, not quite, but the beginning of it. The way a sky looks an hour before dawn, when you can't see the sun yet, but something in the quality of the dark has changed, and you know it's coming. She went to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. October arrived. The way October arrives in Virginia, not gradually, but decisively, as if summer simply stepped aside and let something more serious take its place. The air turned sharp at the edges. The tobacco harvest was finished and the fields put to rest. The South Boundary Barn, now properly the Brooks Valley Reading School, in everything but official name, had its 14 Richmond volumes arranged on Thomas and Rory's shelves, and 17 students attending 4 mornings a week with Agnes Pryor, running the sessions that Elizabeth could not. Life at Brooks Valley was different. Not transformed, she would not use that word, because transformation implied a completeness that hadn't arrived yet, and might not for a long time. But different in the particular way that a household changes when the two people at its center have stopped managing each other and started attempting something more honest. Nathaniel came to the South Boundary on Thursday. Not just that Thursday every Thursday. He came and he did what she had told him to do. He came to learn something. He watched Agnes Pryor run the younger students through their letters, and he watched Elizabeth work with Henry on the legal language in the Virginia land statutes, because Henry had decided at 13 that he was going to be a lawyer, and Elizabeth had not told him that was unlikely. She had handed him the statutes. The first Thursday, Nathaniel had stood at the entrance and watched. The second Thursday, Cora had looked at him directly and said, "Are you learning anything?" And he had said with a straightforwardness that Elizabeth found she respected, "Yes, I'm learning I should have built this 6 years ago." Cora had thought about this and said, "Mrs. Brooks built it, not you." "I know," he said. "That's part of what I'm learning." After that, Cora decided he was acceptable. The third Thursday, he helped Rory add a second chalkboard to the east wall without being asked, and he did it efficiently, and without making a production of it, and Elizabeth watched him do it from across the barn, and thought, "There. That is what action looks like instead of words." It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. She was not building a new marriage on the back of a chalkboard installation. But she had learned in the past months that small things done consistently were the only evidence worth trusting, and she was watching him for evidence. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of October, and it changed the texture of everything. She read it at the kitchen table, and she read it twice, and then she folded it very precisely and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Her father was not well. He wrote it plainly in the direct way of Carter men, without drama, and without softening the cough he'd had since August had not improved. The doctor in Charlottesville had been out twice. Her mother was managing, but would benefit from Elizabeth's company if she could come. He did not ask her to come. He said if you can, which she knew meant please come, because her father had never in her memory asked for anything directly. She told Nathaniel at dinner, not because she needed his permission. She had been very clear with herself on that point, but because she was trying to practice the thing she had asked him for, which was honest communication, and honest communication ran both directions. "I need to go to Charlottesville," she said. "My father is ill. I don't know how long, a week, perhaps 2. He put down his fork. His full attention was on her immediately, the way it had been since the study conversation, and she was still each time slightly recalibrating to it the simple fact of being looked at when she spoke. "How ill?" he said. "I don't know yet. His letter says the cough has persisted since August, and the doctor has been twice. He writes plainly, which means it's more serious than he's saying." "When do you want to leave?" "Thursday morning," she said. "I'll speak with Agnes tonight about covering the school." "I'll have the carriage prepared," he said. "And then, do you want company for the journey?" She looked at him. It was a genuine offer offered without pressure, and she took it seriously rather than dismissing it. "Not for the journey," she said. "But if you could come the following week, if it's appropriate, if he's well enough for company, I think my father might want to know you." Something in Nathaniel's face shifted. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but perceptibly. "I'd like that," he said. "Don't say it if you don't mean it," she said without hardness. "I mean it," he said. "He raised you. I'd like to know the man who taught you accounting and land law, and apparently the particular stubbornness required to build a school in a barn." She almost smiled. "He'd say it wasn't stubbornness. He'd say it was common sense." "Then I'd like to know the man who taught you that too," Nathaniel said. She left Thursday morning before the cold had fully lifted from the fields, with Thomas driving and her trunk packed, and the particular feeling of a woman who is moving towards something she loves, rather than away from something she can't change. Agnes Pryor was on the step when she left, and the schoolteacher gripped her hands briefly and said, "I'll take care of them. Go to your father." Mrs. Hale pressed a parcel of food for the journey into the carriage without comment. Nathaniel stood at the gate. He was not a man who performed goodbyes. She had known that from the beginning, had learned to stop reading absence of performance as absence of feeling. But he was there. He had gotten up earlier than necessary and ridden in from the Northfield to be at the gate before she left, and she saw that and did not pretend she hadn't. "Safe journey," he said. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was practicing honesty in both directions, "I'm glad you'll come next week, if you can." "I'll come," he said. "I told you I would." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded, and Thomas clicked the horses forward, and she rode out of Brooks Valley toward Charlottesville, with the October morning breaking clear and cold around her. Her father was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed when she walked into the farmhouse kitchen and found him at the table, smaller and slower to stand, and when he stood, he was clearly working at it. Her mother was at the fire and turned around with an expression that was relief and worry. In the same breath, the expression of a woman who has been managing something difficult alone and has just been handed help. "There she is," her father said, and opened his arms. She walked into them and hugged him with the careful attentiveness of someone holding something precious, and he patted her back, the way he had always patted her back 3 times. Firm, the particular language of a man who expressed love through reliable action rather than words. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. "Don't argue with me about it." He laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough, and she kept her expression steady while he coughed, and when he was done, she said, "Tell me what the doctor said, exactly." "Your mother. I'll ask her separately. I want to hear your version first." He sat back down at the table and looked at her with the expression he had always worn when she surprised him. The expression that was pride, with a thin layer of amusement over it. "The cough is in the chest," he said. "Been there since August. Doctor thinks it's the same thing that took Harlan Beecham 2 winters ago, though he won't say it plain. He says rest and warmth and not working the fields past October." "Are you resting?" "I'm talking to you, aren't I?" "Papa?" "Some," he said. "More than I'd like." She spent the next 3 days being present in the way that only a daughter who has been taught by her father to be competent can be present. She took over the household accounts. She spoke directly with the doctor on his next visit and asked the questions her parents hadn't thought to ask. She organized the firewood situation that had been handled imprecisely and was threatening to leave them short before January. She sat with her father in the evenings and read to him when the cough was bad, and she let him read to her when it was better from the same novels that had sat above the fireplace her whole childhood. One evening 3 days in, he said, "Your letters have been different." "Have they?" "Since July or so." He was looking at the fire. "You sound like yourself again." She was quiet for a moment. "I had forgotten what that was for a while," she said. "I know," he said. "I was worried about you. I didn't say it because you didn't want to say something that might make it harder." "Yes." He looked at her. "Is it better at Brooks Valley?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "It's different," she said. "He's trying. I don't know yet if trying is enough or if trying will last. But it's real trying, not the kind that stops when the crisis passes." "And you?" "I'm better," she said. Genuinely. Not because of him, or not only. I'm better because I stopped making myself small, and it turns out I fit the actual size of my life quite well. Her father was quiet for a long time. "I should have taught you to demand better from the beginning," he said. "You taught me to be capable," she said. That turned out to be enough. Nathaniel arrived on the Tuesday. She heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the kitchen with her mother going over the January provisions list, and she knew the hoofbeats and something in her chest did the complicated thing it had been doing every time she was reminded that he was making good on what he said. He came to the door and knocked, which she noted he knocked at what was legally the home of his wife's family, because he understood he was a guest here, not a proprietor. Her father answered the door himself. She heard them from the kitchen, the formal exchange of greeting, her father's voice with its careful assessment in it, Nathaniel's voice, with the particular steadiness he carried into situations where he knew he was being measured. Her mother looked at her across the kitchen table. "Well," her mother said, "we'll see." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. She waited 10 minutes before going into the sitting room because she wanted them to have those 10 minutes without her, because she understood instinctively that something important might happen in a room where the two men could look at each other without her present to mediate. When she came in, her father was talking, and Nathaniel was listening with the full attention she had come to recognize, and her father was saying something about the Southfield drainage problem he'd been managing for 3 years, and Nathaniel was asking a specific question about the angle of the land that indicated he had actually been listening and thinking. She sat down and said nothing. Her father glanced at her once, a quick, accurate assessment, and the glance said, "All right, I see it." She gave him a small nod that said, "So do I." "I'm still not sure." He gave her a nod back that said, "Fair enough." That entire conversation happened without a word, in the particular wordless language of a father and daughter who have known each other long enough to need very few of them. Nathaniel stayed 2 days. On the first evening after her parents had gone to bed, he and Elizabeth sat in the kitchen by the fire, the same kitchen she had grown up in, the same table where her father had taught her accounting by lamplight. And they talked in the easy, unmanaged way that had been coming to them gradually since the study conversation, the way of two people who have stopped being strategic with each other. He told her about his mother. Not the version of the story he had started in the study, and stopped the full one. His mother had been a woman of considerable intelligence and education, married at 18, to a man who valued her management of his household and not much else, and who had spent 30 years becoming so accomplished at the invisible work of a Virginia estate wife that no one, including herself, had noticed that she was slowly disappearing. "She died the year before my father," he said. "Everyone thought it was the fever. I think she simply ran out of reason to keep fighting the fever." Elizabeth listened. "She never told you," she said. "She never said a word about it that I can remember," he said. "Which is the worst part. I watched her my entire life, and I didn't understand what I was watching until I watched you do the opposite. She absorbed that. You watched me disappear, and you recognized it," she said. "And you still didn't stop it." "I didn't understand what I was seeing until you stopped," he said. "That is the honest answer, and I hate that it's honest, but it is." She nodded slowly. "That is the thing I needed you to understand," she said. "Not that you were cruel, that you were absent, and that being absent is a choice even when it doesn't feel like one." He looked at the fire. "I know," he said. "I've known it since the night in the study. I wake up with it." "Good," she said without satisfaction. In it just the plain acknowledgement that some things should be woken up with for a while. He looked at her then, and the firelight was on his face, and he was 32 years old, and carrying a great deal, and she saw all of it. "Elizabeth," he said, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me tonight. I'm not sure I've done enough yet to make that a reasonable request. But I want to tell you." He stopped, started again. "I want to tell you that I'm not doing this because I'm afraid of losing you to someone else. I know that's what it might look like. I know that what happened at the supper looked like a man who saw competition and responded to competition. That's not what this is." She waited. "I'm doing this," he said, "because I looked at what you were building, and I looked at what I had failed to see for 2 years, and I felt ashamed. Not in the performing way, in the real way. The kind that changes how you behave the next morning and the morning after that." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. "I don't say that as a conclusion. I say it as a beginning." "That's all I'm asking for," he said. "I know," she said. "It's a lot more than you were giving a few months ago." He almost smiled, which was the most she had seen him give in the direction of genuine humor, and she filed it away in the part of her that was still cautiously collecting evidence. The twist arrived on the morning of his second day, and it came in the form of a letter delivered by a writer from Fredericksburg, addressed to Nathaniel, that had been forwarded from Brooks Valley. He read it at the kitchen table. She watched his face change and said, "What is it?" He handed her the letter. It was from the office of a county magistrate. It concerned the former land agent Caldwell, specifically the investigation that Nathaniel had initiated after Elizabeth's accounting discovery. The investigation had widened. What had appeared to be a straightforward embezzlement from the Brooks estate had proven under scrutiny to be part of a broader scheme. Caldwell had been manipulating accounts for 3 landowners in the county simultaneously, and had in 2 cases forged documents to support false land transfers that had displaced tenant families from properties they had legitimate claim to. 2 of those displaced families were known to Elizabeth. One of the fathers had a daughter attending the South Boundary School. She read to the bottom of the letter, where the magistrate requested Nathaniel's attendance at a hearing in Fredericksburg in 2 weeks' time, and his submission of the original accounting documentation. And then, at the very bottom, a single sentence. "The accounting analysis provided in the initial complaint attributed to your wife has been instrumental in establishing the pattern of fraud. The magistrate extends his acknowledgement to Mrs. Brooks." She set the letter on the table. Nathaniel was watching her. "You knew something was wrong with those numbers in June," he said. "Not an accusation, something closer to wonder. I suspected. I didn't have enough to say anything until I documented it properly." "You documented it in a day." "I documented the basics in a day," she said. I'd been looking at those numbers for 6 months. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the particular motion of someone recalibrating. The families who were displaced, he said. Do you know them? The Marin family, she said. Their daughter Sarah is one of my students. She's 8. They've been living on the Harkin place in a lean-to arrangement since March because they lost the tenancy on the north plot. She paused. I didn't know why. Now I do. Nathaniel stood up from the table. I'm going to Fredericksburg, he said. I'll bring your original documentation, and when the hearing is done and the land transfers are reversed. He stopped. They will be reversed. I'll make certain of it. She looked at him. Nathaniel, she said, that's the Marin family's farm to recover, not yours to give. I know that, he said. I'm not proposing to give it. I'm proposing to make sure the law gives it back, and to make sure no one with more money than they have buries the claim before it gets to the magistrate. She held his gaze. Good, she said. And then she said something she had not said to him in a very long time, since before the harvest gathering, since before the blue dress, since before she understood that saying it into a void had been costing her something essential. Thank you, she said, and she meant it completely. He picked up the letter and folded it carefully. I should thank you, he said, if you hadn't looked at those numbers. I know, she said, but you're choosing to do something with it. That's yours. He looked at her across the kitchen table of her father's house in the morning light of an October Tuesday. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And what moved in the silence between them was not romance, not the simple electricity of two people who want each other. It was something more complicated and more real. It was the beginning of respect, not the performing kind, not the courtesy kind, the kind that is built from watching someone do something hard and honest and important, and recognizing it for exactly what it is. She came back to Brooks Valley the following Friday, 3 days after Nathaniel with her father, better than he'd been. The doctor cautiously optimistic, and her mother's hug at the door, carrying in it the particular quality of a woman who had watched her daughter and felt at last genuinely easy about what she'd seen. Brooks Valley, in mid-October, was the color of copper and amber and the deep green of the late-staying things, and she rode in through the gate as the afternoon light was going long and gold across the fields, and it looked different. Or she was different, and the difference was that she could see it now with both eyes open. Mrs. Hale was waiting in the kitchen with the news. The Marin family, she said before Elizabeth had even set her things down. Mr. Brooks sent word from Fredericksburg. The hearing went well. The magistrate has ordered the land transfer reversed pending formal processing. The family is to have their tenancy restored. Elizabeth set her gloves on the table. When, she said. By November 1st, Mrs. Hale said. And then, with the careful pride of a woman who did not permit herself much expressiveness. Mr. Brooks argued it himself apparently, didn't hire anyone, stood up in front of the magistrate and laid out the whole thing. The accounting work, the pattern, the affected families. She paused. They say he was very clear. Elizabeth thought about Nathaniel Brooks, standing in a magistrate's office in Fredericksburg, laying out the fraud she had found with the clear certainty of a man who has decided what matters and is acting accordingly. I'm sure he was, she said. She went upstairs and unpacked her trunk and stood at the window of her room, the room at the front of the house which she had slept in for 2 years, with the particular loneliness of a woman in the wrong half of a divided house, and she looked out at Brooks Valley in the October light and felt the complicated weight of being someone who has been honest about what they want and is now watching the evidence accumulate piece by piece that what they want might be possible. She was not going to rush it. She was not going to make the mistake of letting relief masquerade as resolution. But she was going to be honest. And when Nathaniel knocked on the sitting room door that evening, knocked the same way he'd knocked at her father's house, and she said, "Come in," and he stood in the doorway, looking like a man who has done something hard and is not sure yet whether it was enough, she looked at him directly and said, "I heard about Fredericksburg." Mrs. Hale, she confirmed. He came in and sat in the chair across from hers, and the fire was going, and the October dark was outside the windows, and the house around them was the same house. It had always been, the same rooms, the same timber, the same creak of floorboards under the weight of their separate lives. But the air between them had changed. "Sarah Marin's family will be home by November," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "This should have been stopped before it started. My negligence allowed Caldwell to operate for years." "Your negligence," she said. "And my accounting fixed it." "Yes," he said simply. "Your accounting fixed it." They sat with that for a moment, the clean accuracy of it, the way it named without drama exactly what had happened and who had done what. "Elizabeth," he said, and stopped. And she waited because she had learned to wait for the real thing rather than filling the space with anything less. "I know I'm not done," he said. "I know that 2 months of showing up differently doesn't balance 2 years of not showing up at all. I'm not asking you to call us even. I'm not asking for anything." He held her gaze, and what was in his eyes was something she had never seen from him in 2 years of mornings and dinners and empty halls. It was honest need without a wall around it. "I just want to keep going, keep learning, keep doing this, whatever this is becoming." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stood in a garden watching him smile for someone else. She thought about the morning she had sat up before dawn and decided to stop disappearing. She thought about Henry and his legal statutes, and the Darcy girl who wanted to know what came after multiplication, and Mrs. Greer's deed, and Sarah Marin's family getting their home back, and Mrs. Lena Fairfax who wanted to keep corresponding, and her father who had looked at Nathaniel across a kitchen table and given her a nod. She thought about all of it, and she held it, and she gave her answer. "Then keep going," she said. Simple as that. Not a declaration. Not a restoration of everything that had been broken. A door left open for a man who had finally learned to knock. He nodded once, the deep nod of someone receiving something they understand the value of. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said. "Good night," she said. He left. She sat by the fire alone and felt the full complicated truth of where she was not healed, not finished, not safely arrived anywhere but clear, honest. Herself, outside. The October wind moved through the Brooks Valley fields, and the harvest was done, and the ground was resting. And somewhere under the cold, the roots were already preparing for spring. November came in hard, not gradually the way. October had eased into cool. November arrived overnight, a cold front dropping out of the north that left frost on the fields by morning and turned the last of the copper leaves to brittle paper overnight. Elizabeth woke to it and felt the change in her bones before she saw it through the window, and she lay there for a moment in the particular clarity of a cold morning and took stock of where she was. 5 months ago she had stood in a garden watching her husband smile at another woman. 4 months ago she had sat up before dawn and decided to stop disappearing. 3 months ago she had built a school in a barn. 2 months ago she had told her husband the truth about 2 years of being unseen, and he had listened without flinching, and afterward she had slept soundly for the first time in longer than she could remember. 1 month ago she had told him to keep going, and he had. She got up dressed without calling for help and went downstairs. Nathaniel was already in the kitchen. This was new. Not the being up early, he had always been up early, but the being in the kitchen, which had always been her space, and Mrs. Hale's space, and the domestic geography of a house he had managed without inhabiting. He was standing at the window with a coffee cup in his hand, looking out at the frost on the east field, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs. "Cold came in fast," he said. "I felt it," she said. She poured her own coffee and stood beside him at the window, not touching, not performing proximity, just two people standing in the same space, looking at the same field, which was itself something they had not done before, and which was, she had learned, the kind of thing that mattered more than it appeared to. "The south boundary barn," he said. "The gaps in the east wall are going to be a problem in January. I'd like to send Thomas and Rory out this week to weatherproof it properly, if that's agreeable to you." She looked at him. "It's agreeable," she said. "I'll have them use the good timber," he said, "not scraps." She held her coffee cup and looked at him, looking at the field, and felt the particular warmth of a thing that is not romance and is not resolution, but is something more durable than both. It was the warmth of being considered, of having her work treated as something worth protecting with good timber. "Thank you," she said. "It's a school," he said simply. It should have a proper wall. Sarah Marin came to the Thursday session for the first time since October with the particular brightness of a child who has had something restored that she didn't know she was grieving the loss of. She sat next to Cora and copied her letters with an intensity that made Elizabeth's chest ache in the good way, the way that meant something mattered. After the session, Sarah's mother appeared at the barn door. Mrs. Marin was a quiet woman. The kind of quiet that comes from years of managing difficult things without complaint, and she stood at the entrance with her hands folded and waited until the other children had gone. "Mrs. Brooks," she said. "Mrs. Marin." Elizabeth began gathering the slates. "I wanted to say—" Mrs. Marin stopped, started again. "I know it was you. The accounting. My husband explained what the magistrate said about who found the fraud. I know it was you, and I wanted you to know that Sarah being in that school—" She stopped again, and her voice was doing the thing that voices do when there is too much in them to come out in order. "We almost left the county, when we lost the tenancy. My husband said there was nothing here for us and we should go west. I almost agreed." Elizabeth set the slates down. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "Sarah wants to be a school teacher," Mrs. Marin said. "She told me last week. She said Mrs. Brooks showed her that women can know things and do things and it matters." She pressed her lips together. "I didn't know how to teach her that myself. I didn't know it growing up. You gave her something I couldn't." Elizabeth walked to the barn door and took Mrs. Marin's hands briefly, not in the performing way of social courtesy, but the direct, honest way of one woman acknowledging another. "She gave herself most of it," Elizabeth said. "I just made sure nobody told her she couldn't." Mrs. Marin nodded and left, and Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the barn school and listened to the November wind in the field and felt something settle in her. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter and more permanent than either. She had built something real. Whatever happened in her marriage, whatever Nathaniel became or didn't become, this was hers. It would stand without him. It had been built without him. And that, she understood, was the only kind of thing worth having, the kind that didn't require someone else's eyes on it to make it real. Nathaniel was at the gate when she rode back, the same as he had been that first Thursday in September, but different in every way that mattered. He did not have the expression of a man who has arrived accidentally and is navigating an unexpected situation. He had the expression of a man who came to the gate because he wanted to be there when she got back. "Sarah's mother came," Elizabeth said, dismounting. "I know," he said. "She stopped at the house first, looking for you." He took the horse's reins without being asked. "What did she say?" "She said Sarah wants to be a school teacher." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" She looked at him. "And I told her Sarah gave herself most of it, which is true." "Is it?" he said. He handed the reins to Thomas and fell into step beside her toward the house. "Because from where I've been standing the past 2 months, what you gave those children is not a small thing. It changes what's possible for them. What Sarah thinks she can be because of what she's seen you be." She walked beside him and felt the weight of that, not with vanity, not with pride in the performed sense, but with the honest acknowledgement of someone receiving accurate information. "Yes," she said. "All right, it's not a small thing." "No," he said. "It isn't." They walked to the house side by side in the November cold, and it was not romantic. It was not the sweep of a feeling that makes a person lose their footing. But it was real, and real, she had decided, was what she was building her life around. The first snow came in the 3rd week of November, earlier than anyone expected, and it came fast, and it came serious. Elizabeth was at the south boundary when it started, not teaching. It was a Tuesday, but she had ridden out to check on the supply of firewood at the barn school after Nathaniel's crew had done the weatherproofing, and she was inside testing the new wallboards when the light outside changed. She came to the door and saw the sky, and understood immediately that she had 20 minutes, maybe less, before the visibility on the road dropped to nothing. She made it to the horse, and the horse made it a mile before the snow was thick enough to make the road uncertain, and another half-mile before Elizabeth admitted, with the particular honesty of a woman who has learned to see situations clearly, that she was not going to make it back to Brooks Valley in this. She turned the horse toward the nearest property. She knew the Darcy farm 3/4 of a mile off the main road and pushed through the white. She made it. The Darcy family opened their door before she had finished knocking, and the warmth of their kitchen closed around her like something she had earned, and she stood there dripping snow and catching her breath, while young Clara Darcy, 6 years old and absolutely certain of her own capabilities, said, "I knew you'd come here. You know everybody." "I know everybody on this road," Elizabeth said, and accepted the cup Mrs. Darcy pressed into her hands. She sent word with the Darcy's eldest boy, who knew the roads to get to Brooks Valley, and let them know she was safe. She was not worried about herself. She was settled at the Darcy kitchen table with a blanket and a cup of cider, and Clara Darcy explaining to her in great detail the plot of a story she had apparently invented entirely on her own, and Elizabeth was genuinely listening, genuinely entertained, genuinely present in the particular way of a woman who is exactly where she is, and not waiting to be somewhere else. What she did not expect was Nathaniel. He arrived 2 hours later. She heard the horse before she heard him at the door, and she knew it immediately. She always knew his horse, and she was already standing when Mrs. Darcy opened the door, and Nathaniel came in snow on his coat and his hat, and the particular set of his jaw that she had learned to read as the expression of a man who has been managing something difficult and is containing the evidence of it. He looked at her standing at the kitchen table. He said, "You're all right." Not a question. The statement of a man who has ridden 3 miles in a snowstorm and has arrived at the thing he came for. "I'm all right," she said. "I was settled. You didn't need to come." "Yes, I did," he said. He said it the way he had said "I wanted you" the day he fell from the fence, simply without a wall around it, without the management of a man protecting himself from his own meaning. Mrs. Darcy made herself busy at the fire, with the tact of a woman who understands when a kitchen has become someone else's important room. Clara Darcy had no such tact, and was staring at Nathaniel with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has opinions. "Are you her husband?" she said. "I am," Nathaniel said. "She talks about the school all the time," Clara said. "She built it. Did you help?" A pause. "Not enough," Nathaniel said. "At the beginning. I'm trying to do better." Clara considered this with the gravity of a child taking testimony. "That's what my papa says when he forgets something important," she said. "Mama says it's what a person does after that counts." Nathaniel looked at this 6-year-old child for a moment. "Your mama," he said, "is a wise woman." "I know," said Clara, and went back to her story. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel across the Darcy kitchen, and something moved between them. Not the complicated weight of what they were still working through. Not the careful navigation of two people rebuilding trust, but something lighter and more immediate. The corners of her mouth moved. He saw it. And something happened on his face that she had seen only a handful of times, the expression that meant he was genuinely, unguardedly in the moment. He almost smiled. They rode back together when the snow let up enough for the road leading both horses slowly through the white and the dark and the cold, was the kind that gets inside a coat regardless of its quality, and makes a person acutely aware of what warmth feels like. He rode close enough that their horses' breath mingled in the cold air. "Clara Darcy is remarkable," he said. "She's going to run something someday," Elizabeth said. "A school, or a business, or an entire county. She hasn't decided yet." "She'll decide," he said. "She will," Elizabeth agreed, "because nobody in her life has told her she can't." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what happened to you?" he said. "Someone told you that you couldn't." "No," she said. "Nobody told me I couldn't. They just didn't tell me I could. And then I married a man who didn't see me doing anything at all." She kept her voice even because this was not an accusation. In this moment, it was just the truth, and she had gotten comfortable with speaking the truth in the cold and the dark and the open air where it couldn't be contained. The absence of encouragement over time becomes its own kind of wall. He absorbed that. "I'm sorry," he said. And it was different from any apology he had offered before, not the social apology of a man managing an uncomfortable situation, but the plain, heavy, genuine sorry of a man who has finally located the specific thing he is sorry for. She heard the difference. "I know," she said. By the fire at Brooks Valley that night, with the snow still coming down outside, and the house settled warm around them. They sat in the sitting room together, not by design, just because that was where they both were, and it was Nathaniel who spoke first. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it as information, not as a request." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I spoke with Reed last week," he said. She went very still, not with alarm, with attention. "He came to the farm to drop off books for the school," Nathaniel continued. "I was there. We talked." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "He's a good man. I want you to know that I can see that. He is the kind of man who sees people the way I failed to see you." She held very still. "He told me." Nathaniel said that you had asked him once at the market whether your work looked like avoidance from the outside. Whether you were running away from your life rather than toward something real. He paused. "He told me what he said to you, that it looked like a woman running toward something, not away." A pause that had weight in it. He was right. And I needed to hear it from him because I needed to understand what I was seeing at that harvest supper wasn't a man who wanted my wife. It was a man who was showing me what I had failed to be. Elizabeth breathed. "You talked to Samuel Reed about me," she said. "I talked to Samuel Reed about myself," he said. "He happened to know you very well for a man who has known you 4 months, which was its own lesson." She looked at the fire. "What did he say?" she asked. "Exactly. He said, 'Mr. Brooks, your wife is one of the most capable people I have encountered in this county. She built something from nothing because she stopped waiting for permission. If you are going to be the man she deserves, I reckon you need to understand that what she needs from you is not management or provision, or even protection. It's the simple recognition that she is your equal, not your ward, not your responsibility, your equal." Nathaniel paused. "He said reckon. He's from Philadelphia." Elizabeth looked at him. And something happened that she had not expected, something that started in her chest and moved up unstoppable and came out of her as a laugh. A real one. The unrehearsed kind that starts before you've decided to allow it. Nathaniel watched her laugh, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Not smiling, not yet, but open, the way a window is open, letting something in. "He's a good man," she said when she had recovered. "Yes," Nathaniel agreed. "He told me to stop managing the situation and start inhabiting it. He said those words exactly." "He's right," she said. "I know." He leaned forward, both elbows on his knees, in the posture of a man who has decided to be fully present in a difficult conversation. "Elizabeth, I want to say something I have never said to you in 2 years of marriage, and I want to say it plainly, because I have spent 2 years not saying things plainly, and I am done with that." She waited. "I love you," he said. "Not because you're useful to me, though you are. Not because you manage this house or keep the accounts or built a school that half the county is now talking about. I love you because I love who you are. The woman who knocked on my study door and I turned away from. The woman who sat up before dawn and decided to stop disappearing. The woman who made a 6-year-old girl believe she could run the county." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him, and she could hear the cost and respected it. "I love you. I am telling you because you deserve to hear it, and because I should have understood it 2 years ago, and because I am done being a man who knows something true and doesn't say it." The fire burned. The snow fell outside. She sat with what he had said, and did not rush past it or qualify it immediately, because it deserved to be sat with. He had said it plainly, and it had been plainly said, and she owed it the same. "I know you do," she said finally. "I can see it. These past months I can see it in what you've done." "But," he said. "No but," she said. "I'm telling you I see it. That's not nothing." She held his gaze. "Nathaniel, I am not the woman I was in June. I told you that in September, and I mean it more completely now than I did then. The woman who needed you to love her in order to feel real, she found out she was real on her own. I don't need your love to be who I am." "I know that," he said. "But I want it," she said. And saying it was not weakness, and she knew it was not weakness, and she said it with the full steadiness of someone who has earned the right to say what she wants without apologizing for wanting it. I want it because I choose to want it, not because I need it. There is a very large difference." He looked at her with eyes that held for the first time in 2 years everything they had previously kept hidden. "I understand the difference," he said quietly. "And I want you to choose it, every day, as a choice, not as a need." She breathed. "Then we are saying the same thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I believe we are." Spring came back to Brooks Valley, the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcement, simply arriving one morning in the smell of the soil and the sound of the birds returning, and the first green of the things that had been waiting underground through all the cold months. Elizabeth walked out to the east field before breakfast on the first real morning of it, in the early light, with the particular fullness of a woman who has come through something and is standing on the other side of it with both feet on the ground. She thought about the woman who had stood in this same field 2 years ago, watching the same morning come up, waiting for a life that would not come if she kept waiting. She thought about the woman who had made herself smaller than her actual size and called it devotion. She thought about the morning she had sat up before dawn and decided to stop. The school at the south boundary had 18 students now, with a second teacher being trained, a young woman from the western county who had heard about the program through the Richmond Society and written to Elizabeth directly. Mrs. Lena Fairfax had become a genuine correspondent, and there were conversations being had in Richmond about using the South Boundary program as a model for similar efforts in other rural counties. Sarah Marin came every Thursday without fail, and had begun helping with the younger students in the way of someone who has already decided what she is. Henry had written with Elizabeth's encouragement to a lawyer in Charlottesville who was known to take on apprentices of demonstrated ability regardless of their family circumstances. The lawyer had written back. Mrs. Greer's deed was registered properly in her name. The Marin family's tenancy was restored. Caldwell was facing a hearing that would cost him more than his position. Elizabeth had done all of that, and she stood in the east field on the first morning of spring and let herself know it, not in pride, not in triumph, but in the plain, honest way of a woman taking inventory of what she had built and finding the inventory good. She heard footsteps behind her and did not need to turn to know them. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the field and looked at the same morning she was looking at, and she knew she had learned to know that his silence was not absence. It was presence. The quiet kind. The kind he was learning to make into something she could feel, rather than something that left her cold. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to see it," she said. "First morning of spring." He was quiet. "Elizabeth." His voice was different from last November, different from September, different from all the versions she had catalogued over 2 years of learning to read a man who had not known how to be read. "I have something for you." She turned. He was holding a letter. She took it. The seal was from the office of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the signatures inside formal and precise, and it took her 2 readings to fully understand what she was looking at. It was the formal recognition of the Brooks Valley Reading School as an established educational institution under the Commonwealth's records, a designation that meant, among other practical things, that the program had legal standing to receive donated materials, to apply for educational grants, and to be named independently of the land it occupied. Named independently. She read the name on the designation line. The Carter School, Brooks Valley, Virginia. Founded and directed by Mrs. Elizabeth Carter Brooks. She looked up at him. "How did you? This takes months of—" "I started the paperwork in October," he said. "After Fredericksburg. I knew what you'd built, and I knew what it deserved, and I knew that it needed to have your name on it. Not mine, not Brooks Valley's. Yours." He held her gaze. "Your father's attorney helped with the filing. He sends his regards." She looked at the document. She looked at her name on the designation line. Carter, her own name, the name her father had given her, sitting first and clear. Her throat was doing something complicated. "You called it Carter," she said. "It's yours," he said. "It was always yours. I just wanted the paper to say so." She stood in the east field, in the first morning of spring, with the document in her hands, and felt the full weight of it. Not just the school, not just the legal standing, but what the gesture meant from a man who had spent 2 years not seeing her, and had spent the past 7 months learning slowly and honestly how to see. This was not an apology. This was a man who had understood something true and had acted on it in the specific, permanent, documented way of someone who intends for the understanding to last. She folded the document carefully, held it. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was completely steady, because the gratitude was not fragile. It was solid, built on months of evidence, resting on ground that had been tested. "It's a beginning," he said, "not an end." "I know," she said. "I know exactly what it is." She looked at him in the spring morning, this man she had married in hope, and nearly lost herself trying to love this man who had taken 2 years to learn to look, and was now, she believed, genuinely looking, and she made a choice. Not the desperate choice of a woman who needs to be loved in order to feel real. Not the resigned choice of a woman who has decided this is what she gets. The free choice. The clear-eyed, both feet on the ground, fully herself choice of a woman who knows exactly who she is and is choosing to love him anyway. Not because she has to. Not because she waited long enough, but because he had done the work of becoming someone worth choosing, and she had done the work of becoming someone who could choose freely, and those two things had met in this field on this morning, and made something neither of them had managed alone. She took his hand, not tentatively, not with the hoping quality of someone reaching for something they're not sure they'll be allowed to keep. She took it the way she did everything now, directly, honestly, without apology. He held it. They stood in the east field of Brooks Valley, as the Virginia spring came up around them. Two people who had come the long way to the same place, and the morning was full and clear and entirely theirs. Elizabeth Carter Brooks had stopped waiting for someone to see her. Value had built something real from the ground up. With her own hands, and her own mind had learned to name what she needed and refuse what she would not accept. Had loved a man honestly enough to tell him the truth about what his absence had cost. And she had arrived at 25 in the spring of 1817. Not at the end of anything, but at the beginning of the life she had always been capable of living. She had not needed rescuing. She had not needed permission. She had needed only to remember one cold morning before dawn that she was already whole. And that was the thing she carried forward. Not the love story, not the school, not the document with her name on it. Though all of those were real, and all of those were hers. The thing she carried was the knowledge settled permanent in her bones that a woman who knows her own worth does not wait for the world to confirm it. She builds, she speaks, she chooses, and she keeps choosing every single day with both eyes open and both feet on the ground. That is not a small thing. That is everything.